In December of 1990, the U.S. government will sign a new agricultural trade agreement as part of GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Federal and state laws which now protect consumers, farmers, and the environment could be dramatically changed or overturned. To understand clearly how GATT could affect our lives, let's begin with a brief look at its history.
The bills are all due, the babies need shoes, I'm busted. Cotton is down a quarter pound, I'm busted.
The roots of GATT can be traced to the global economic crisis of the 1930s, partially caused by the chaos in world trade that followed the First World War. In the United States, the economic crisis of the Great Depression was a major factor in the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. Among the first bills he introduced was national legislation, often called the Parity Farm Program, to revive family farm agriculture and to stabilize the rural economy. Roosevelt's farm program had three major components: price supports to stabilize farm income, emergency food reserves to protect consumers, and production control programs to prevent wasteful surpluses. The key to Roosevelt's plan for preventing wasteful surpluses was government assistance to farmers to help them balance their production with demand. This was successfully accomplished through two programs: domestic supply management and limits on imports. Roosevelt's program to limit imports was included in Section 22 of the 1935 Farm Bill. This law authorized the president to impose import controls when needed to protect family farmers. After World War II, the United States worked with other nations to create the world's first multi-country trade agreement, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Although the original GATT treaty was primarily concerned with regulating trade in manufactured goods, it did include special provisions for agriculture. The most important agriculture provision was Article 11 of the GATT treaty, which permitted the United States and other countries to continue to use import controls to protect family farms. By the early 1970s, many U.S.-based multinational food companies had shifted much of their fruit and vegetable production overseas in search of lower wages and weaker pesticide regulations. As a result, U.S. imports of fresh produce increased dramatically. Beef imports also grew as large areas of rainforest in Central and South America were destroyed to create a cheap source of hamburger for fast food restaurants. The end result of this shifting of food production overseas was that the United States suddenly became one of the world's largest importers of food. These huge food imports were a significant factor in our nation's trade deficit in 1971, the first since 1888. Fearing that this trade deficit would force President Nixon to restrict imports, agribusiness corporations who were profiting greatly from the expansion of production overseas launched a massive lobbying effort. They were able to convince President Nixon that the solution to the trade deficit was to expand U.S. exports of raw agricultural commodities, not to further restrict imports of beef, fresh produce, or other agricultural products. These corporations urged Nixon to reduce the prices paid to U.S. farmers to make U.S. food exports cheaper. They argued that lower prices were needed to drive other exporting nations out of the world market. They proposed that the drop in the farm family income which would result from these price cuts could be partially offset by direct government payments, called deficiency payments. President Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, lobbied hard to convince Nixon to adopt the policies recommended by agribusiness. After Nixon agreed, Butz called it an historic turning point in the philosophy of farm programs. Since then, farm income has come increasingly from the government, not from the market. For a few years, the strategy seemed to work. Crop failures in the U.S. and large purchases by the Soviet Union reduced U.S. crop surpluses. Secretary Butz urged farmers to plant fence row to fence row. Although this export-oriented strategy was profitable for a few grain merchants and chemical companies, it failed to create prosperity for family farmers. Facing rising costs while their prices were being cut by the government, farmers were forced to go into debt to cover their losses. As a result, farm debt rose to over $200 billion. By the early 1980s, rural America was in the midst of a full-scale economic depression. Two sharply contrasting views of this crisis emerged. Some argued that the loss of export markets was the main cause of this crisis. Advocates of this point of view recommended that the U.S. government should lower farm prices even further, to levels far below the cost of production. Their hope was to drive other exporting nations like Brazil and Thailand out of the market. A completely different analysis was offered by a number of family farm organizations and commodity groups. In their opinion, low prices were the cause, not the solution, to the farm crisis. They urged Congress to raise farm prices to the cost of production. To prevent surpluses, they urged that the supply be balanced with demand by controlling both domestic production and imports. Citing research from the Food and Agriculture Policy Research Institute, they predicted that by raising farm prices, export earnings would rise and government costs could be significantly reduced. Lowering farm prices, they argued, would yield lower export earnings and would increase government costs. In 1985, Congress adopted a new farm bill which incorporated elements of both of these points of view. For some crops, cost of production prices and supply management programs were passed into law. For other crops, such as corn, wheat, rice, cotton, and soybeans, the opposite approach was adopted. The 1985 Farm Bill cut prices dramatically in hopes that this would increase exports. During the first 2 years of the 1985 Farm Bill, corn prices were cut by 43%. As predicted by FAPRI, the value of corn exports also dropped, falling by over 45%. As prices were cut, taxpayer costs soared. For one crop, corn, annual costs rose to over $12 billion. This cost was more than 3 times the value of all corn exported that year. This chart illustrates the close relationship between the price of corn and the value of our corn exports. U.S. corn exports continued to fall until farm prices began to move higher in the late 1980s due to severe drought. Although food processors and grain exporters enjoyed record profits, the 1985 Farm Bill failed to return prosperity to rural America. Although the volume of exports rose, the value of farmers' crops continued to drop, creating an even more depressed condition in the countryside. Fearing that Congress would eventually turn away from this low-price approach, the agribusiness corporations urged President Reagan to initiate international trade negotiations through GATT. Their strategy was to use the power of GATT to ensure the continuation of this policy approach. Under a little-known provision of U.S. law called fast-track authority, the President has the power to negotiate GATT trade agreements in secret. Once he has completed negotiations, the final GATT agreement is submitted to Congress for their approval. Under the special rules of the fast-track authority, Congress cannot change the final agreement. They can only say yes or no. If a GATT agreement is approved by a simple majority in Congress, then all existing U.S. laws must be brought into compliance with GATT. The strategy of agribusiness was to convince Congress to pass a GATT agreement that would protect low-price policies by specifically prohibiting the use of import controls, supply management, and other farm price support programs. In September of 1986, the Reagan administration initiated a new round of GATT talks, called the Uruguay Round. The chief U.S. agricultural negotiator at GATT, former Cargill Grain Company executive Daniel Amstutz, outlined the administration's goals for these talks. First, they wanted GATT to restrict the ability of Congress to set domestic farm policies. According to Washington Farm columnist Jonathan Harsh, White House strategists acknowledged that what they are doing now in the GATT talks should make it virtually impossible to reverse the direction of U.S. farm policy. Second, they wanted GATT to overturn some existing U.S. farm programs, environmental laws, and pesticide regulations. This objective was stated explicitly by U.S. Trade Representative Carla Hills in a recent letter to the government of El Salvador. She promised that the current administration was pursuing the elimination of the U.S. sugar program through the agricultural negotiations in the Uruguay round. Their third goal was to use GATT to try to make changes in the farm and food safety policies in other countries. For example, some third world countries restrict food exports in times of famine to protect their own citizens from starvation. The U.S. condemns this practice as a violation of free trade and has proposed that GATT rules should prohibit countries from protecting their food supply in this way. In July of 1987, White House GATT negotiators made their first concrete proposal to GATT. In this proposal, the U.S. called for ending nearly all farm programs within 10 years. Second, they proposed the elimination of almost all import and export controls. And third, the U.S. proposed a global harmonization plan that would lower the pesticide standards applied to imported foods here in the United States to much weaker international standards. Although these proposals have been strongly supported by agribusiness, food processing, and farm chemical corporations, most family farm organizations have spoken out strongly against the plan. They argued that it would flood world markets with huge surpluses, driving down prices and forcing millions of families off their land. Church leaders also condemned the proposal, predicting it would increase world hunger. Lower world prices, they said, would displace small farmers and increase corporate control over our food. Environmentalists have attacked the U.S. plan, arguing that it would lead to further destruction of rainforests, further accelerating the process of global warming. In addition, environmental organizations have strongly condemned the plan to weaken U.S. pesticide regulations. Consumer groups fear that if food safety standards applied to imported foods are weakened, it could jeopardize the safety of the entire U.S. food supply. Ralph Nader has condemned this GATT proposal as an effort to usher in a new era of unbridled multinational corporate power. Many state and local elected officials oppose the U.S. proposal, fearing that GATT will be used to preempt their authority to protect consumers, farmers, and the environment. Many members of Congress also oppose this plan, arguing that it would undercut their authority to protect the safety and security of both our food supply and our environment. Over 100 members of Congress have co-sponsored legislation or sent letters to the administration opposing various sections of this proposal. In July of 1990, the Bush administration announced its support for a final GATT agreement that incorporated many of the earlier U.S. demands. This final proposal, formerly called the DeSeo Plan, included the U.S. plan called tariffication, where all import controls would be converted into tariffs and then reduced or eliminated within 10 years. The goal is to open the U.S. borders to unlimited imports of beef, dairy, peanuts, fruits, and vegetables, and other products. A broad range of economists, policymakers, and farm leaders have warned that tariffication could easily be evaded by currency or price manipulations. This would allow virtually unlimited growth in agricultural imports, causing even greater U.S. trade deficits. They have also noted that since American farmers face stricter environmental regulations and higher taxes than farmers in most other countries, costs of production here in the United States are often higher than in other exporting nations. Under tariffication, a flood of cheap imports from other countries would add to the economic problems facing America's family farmers. This final GATT proposal also calls for the reduction or elimination of almost all domestic farm programs. This threatens both traditional price stabilization programs and many of the new programs designed to provide incentives for sustainable agriculture. In place of all these current programs, this GATT proposal would allow governments of rich countries to give their farmers welfare-type payments they call decoupling. After a few years, these would be eliminated. A number of third world countries have strongly objected to decoupling. They argue that only rich countries could afford it and that it would drive world prices even lower by causing huge surpluses. On the issue of health and safety regulations, this final GATT proposal includes the Bush administration's global harmonization plan. Under this proposal, GATT could reduce the authority of Congress and state governments to set minimum standards for imported foods. As an example of how harmonization would work, U.S. Agriculture Secretary Clayton Yoder has urged Europe not to impose a ban on BGH, an artificial growth hormone being tested on U.S. dairy cows. He opposed the ban, arguing that this would certainly contravene our mutual objective of achieving international harmonization in the sensitive area of food safety. Another example was detailed by Agriculture Secretary Yoder in recent testimony to Congress, where he called for using global harmonization under GATT to overturn new California pesticide regulations. If successful, harmonization would turn back the clock on progress made by local and state governments to protect the safety of their food and the environment. Recognizing that these new U.S. GATT proposals pose serious threats, a wide range of farm, church, consumer, trade union, and environmental groups have formed a national fair trade campaign to persuade Congress to speak out on GATT before it is too late. The Fair Trade Campaign is opposing any and all proposals which would take away the power from U.S. citizens, state legislatures, or Congress to set minimum food and environmental safety standards. The Fair Trade Campaign is working to ensure that the final GATT agreement does not interfere with the right of Congress to set U.S. farm and food security policies, including the right to control imports. Third, the Fair Trade Campaign is asking Congress to insist that GATT begins to address global food security and hunger issues, with a special focus on the needs of third world countries, including an end to export dumping and the creation of food reserves. The stakes in this GATT debate are high. Our rural economies, our food security, and our environment are at risk. And the stakes will become even higher in the future, when the ecological dangers of our heavy use of oil, coal, and other fossil fuels will force all nations to search for safer alternatives. The environmentally safe and renewable resources, which can be harvested from our farms, forests, and oceans, could be the energy and raw material sources of the future. But will these valued resources still be there in the future, in the hands of a broad foundation of farm families and rural communities caring for this land to ensure that future generations may inherit a healthier and more productive nation? Or will the current round of GATT negotiations wipe out family farms by encouraging the growth of absentee owners, speculators, and corporate agribusiness? Action now will make the difference. Here are 3 simple things you can do. First, take a few minutes to write a letter to your congressional representatives and senators in Washington. Tell them what you think of the current U.S. proposals to GATT. Encourage them to co-sponsor and vote for the resolutions now under consideration. Send a copy of your letter and their response to your local newspaper. Meet with all candidates in this fall's elections to inform them about GATT and tell them your concerns and ideas. Ask them to pledge to vote against any GATT agreement that does not ensure the adequate protection of consumers, family farmers, and the environment. Third, make sure that the organizations that you belong to study the GATT issues and take a position. Show this videotape to these groups. Congress can and will demand positive GATT reforms if enough of us let them know what's at stake. Working together, we can maintain a viable family farm system and revitalize rural America. Together, we can preserve our land and water resources for our children and for the generations to come.